Ofcom is set to gain more powers to regulate the BBC and will monitor the corporation's news website for the first time as part of a series of changes unveiled by the government. Under the plans, the media regulator will be able to take enforcement action if articles don't meet relevant broadcast standards. The organisation's YouTube channel will now also be subject to the same guidance. This comes as the BBC is facing tougher scrutiny amid claims of bias. The government says the reforms are intended to boost public trust. Joining me now on the programme is Ali Ross, TV critic at The Sun. Good to have you on, Ali. Thanks for joining me. I think some people will say that when people are in doubt, when something really important or very worrying occurs, they go straight to the BBC because the BBC is the bastion of trust. It's considered by people to be something, an organisation, institution you can believe in.
Yeah, that's probably true. And I think as much of that is habit. So many of us have grown up with the BBC. And personally, I'm behind these moves as it's done to reinforce that, because nothing threatens the BBC, particularly at this moment, quite like accusations of bias, which have been running at a rate of about 600,000 a year, but only 25 complaints are upheld. So the public are perfect right to say, well, hang on, this process isn't working for us. There is a problem here. And I think this is an attempt, a reasonably sensible attempt to deal with that, although it doesn't stretch to certain presenters' social media accounts, which are probably more in the spotlight than anything at the moment.
No, it certainly doesn't. But I suppose when you talk about biased news coverage, it very much depends, doesn't it, upon your own perspective on a particular event, upon your own sympathies, your own history, your own predilections, whatever they happen to be, your religious affiliations, and you watch an item and you think, oh, my God, that's biased. But somebody else, maybe in the house next door to you, watching the same item, thinks it's incredibly accurate. What kind of bias is the BBC in general thought to be guilty of? Biased in what direction? About what?
I think rather than party political, it's thought to be institutionally woke. And to give you an example of what's happened with the website, they had an article on Francis Drake recently where he was just referred to as 16th century slave trader.
Oh.
Rather than there's the guy who won the Armada battle or circumnavigated the globe. And it's running at an average of well over one article on the transatlantic slave trade a week on that website. So they have an agenda, they have a woke view of the world, which certainly extends to the sort of stuff that I watch. EastEnders is the one I always cite. And I say this as someone who voted Remain at the vote, but weeks after that, EastEnders suddenly introduced a EU night at the Queen Vic. And you think, well, on what planet would that actually happen other than Planet BBC? Where shows like EastEnders and a lot of the comedies, certainly the panel comedies, just reflect this sort of woke view of the world. And nothing else.
But are we not getting confused, Ali? If we're talking about news bulletins and you know, unbiased, objective, if that is at all possible, news coverage, that's one thing. If we're talking about the script of EastEnders, which is a fictional soap opera set in a fictional place in which fictional characters go to a fictional pub, that's not really the same thing, is it? Because that can be the vision of the script writers, and they're a large team of writers, probably with all sorts of different political views and of different political persuasions. So, you know, what happens on EastEnders may not happen in your pub, but even if it would never happen in any pub, it's a fantasy about a fictional load of people doing something that they haven't really done in an unreal world. What we see on the news, though, is a very different thing. And you might also say what we don't see on the news, what is included, what isn't included, how the news editors make their choices, the sorts of reporters they choose to use, and the particular views that those reporters might have and might not try very hard to conceal. You know, those sorts of things you might say are far more worrying than whether comedians on a particular show simply say the word Rishi Sunak and crack up and assume the whole audience will laugh and ridicule Sunak and everybody's on the same page on that. I mean, that's comedy, the other's fiction, the other's drama, but the news is a whole different ballgame, made in a different place, in a different way, by different teams. I'm assuming for a different purpose, isn't it?
Yeah, but the news has been thrown into sharp focus ever since October the 7th. 6 BBC reporters have been suspended for sending pro-Palestinian tweets. And I don't need to tell you that BBC is an organisation which will describe the Dam Busters as an infamous raid during the Second World War, but won't describe Hamas as a terrorist organisation. And that comes back to the woke view of the world. So I think it seeps into everything. And obviously the news is far more sinister, but it's just a groupthink that tends to exist, I think, in that building, whatever the subject, whether it's sport, EastEnders, or the news bulletins.
I mean, I would say, you know, I worked at the BBC for the large part of 30 years and largely in news and current affairs, not only, but largely. And the idea that there is kind of a view, or there's a person or a small little factory of people all in harmony churning out a particular view isn't usually the case. But then I wouldn't be telling the truth if I didn't say it is sometimes the case. I remember, for example, when we were only allowed to say credit crunch and we weren't allowed to say recession or something. There was a particular diktat. But there weren't very many in 30 years of things you could and couldn't say, or ways in which you could or couldn't say them. And I know that as a presenter myself, I used to be accused of all manner of political partisanship. You know, I was accused of being a communist. I was accused of being a fascist. Seriously, I was accused of being the best friend of Boris Johnson. I was accused of being the best friend of Ken Livingstone. I was accused of, you know, so many
You've got
different...
too many friends, Vanessa.
Yeah, I've got lots of friends. What can I say? I'm a very lovely person with a whole lot of friends. But I mean, I was accused of so many biases in so many different directions. It made me think I was probably doing my job pretty well, because I was hoping nobody knew what I really thought. And actually, most of the time, I had no idea what I really thought. I was still waiting to have my mind made up. I still didn't really know. But what I'm saying is, you know, the BBC is accused of bias and partisanship and not being objective, but by so many different factions and so many different irate protesters that you wonder whether actually it's doing a reasonable job, and this wokery thing and this kind of caucus of people with only one view isn't really true and doesn't very often rear its head, even if it is.
Well, yeah, sure. I'm just reflecting my own probably hideously biased opinion there. But the fact is that you have this huge number of complaints about bias. So instead of letting the BBC mark its own homework, they've handed it over to Ofcom. And personally, as a licence payer and someone who would want the BBC in some form to continue, and I think it's a good idea, and we'll probably have a clearer picture once this process is introduced, rather than the paltry 25 complaints that are upheld a year at the moment.
How do we know that the Ofcom bods, who will then be in charge and will be guarding the guards,
Vanessa.
How do we know that they won't come from some left-wing or right-wing?
Who marks the homework markers? Indeed. Yeah, and then who would mark their homework?
Quite.
It could go on indefinitely, but at some point we have to draw a line and say, that's enough bureaucrats, because I think we're doing okay on that.
And I would just say that, you know, the Ofcom equivalent, whether it's, you know, supervising education in schools, we hear a lot about them, whether it's supervising the water supply, we hear a lot about them, whether it's supporting energy suppliers, you know, whichever particular sort of Ofcom is in charge of all the different services and things that we enjoy in this country or hope to, usually we hear them described as toothless sharks who really have done absolutely nothing, have been paid a great deal of money and have presided over the general dissolution and dissipation of whatever it was the organisation was meant to be. How do we know that these Ofcom bods, who are suddenly going to be judging what goes out on the news, won't simply be working from home, having a piece of cake, and won't have the faintest idea what they're trying to do or doing?
It's a very bleak view of the world, Vanessa, but yes, you're right. If any good comes of this at all, then it might just be the BBC telling me to shut up and saying, well, we're not marking our own homework anymore. We've got an independent group in to do it. But hopefully there will be some progress once this is introduced, because it can't be as bad as the system that they've got at the moment.
All right, Ali, thank you very much. Always a pleasure to see you. Many years ago, I never thought I was going to say that to Ali Ross, but actually he's a great guest on the show, and I am pleased to see him.